right, welcome everybody to the spring colloquium series. Thank you so much for coming today. We are excited to have Dr. Gary Painter with us. So he has been at USC for over 2 decades and just recently became a Buckeye and gave the University of Cincinnati. So he brought the S from his school. He brought the house prices of California to Ohio. So
sorry, if they start going up to top fast and you're not yet a homeowner. Turns out that if you already are a homeowner, you're kind of happy about it.
Yeah, no, but he is now running the Center for Real Estate at the University of Cincinnati, but also does some really great work on social innovation, social impact bonds, that sort of thing, urban economics more generally. So we're super excited to have him here in Ohio and welcome everybody.
Thank you so much for having me up. It's an easy trip. For me, it's kind of like driving from my house in Long Beach to UCLA. It's about the same distance as coming from Cincinnati to Columbus. So it's really felt like, oh, I finally had it. Normal traffic again since moving here, so it's been good. So this is a paper as part of a research agenda, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. For those of us who are in the room that were trained as economists and are tend to use data, you know, in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and so forth, what I spent most of my career doing, I decided because sometimes those data don't give you the answers to certain questions that just can't be asked. I went into a phase of my career where I started to try to collect data myself or within teams, since I'm not really good at doing it, trained as an economist, but you put a team together, people who are good at primary data collection. So this project is one of those kinds of projects where we really wanted to understand much more deeply, as I'll talk about in just a moment, with kind of like what's happening for people who are experiencing housing insecurity in a variety of different ways. So this is co-authored with our project. Sean Hanks just recently, he's the lead author on the paper. He just recently took a position at Cal State Fullerton. Soledad De Gregario, last year took a position at App Associates, and Giovanna Rosen took a position at Rutgers in the Public Policy School. So these are all folks who were there at USC at one time, and now none of us are at USC anymore. But the data live on, which is great. So the title of the paper, as you see here, we're going to be looking at landlord behavior and how that interacts with market dynamics. So let me talk about the research agenda, what we were trying to accomplish with the survey that we ended up deploying. And we're hoping, of course, that you have many papers that come out of this primary data collection. So especially situated in California, not as bad in Ohio, but situated in California, more and more people were experiencing what we call housing cost burden. And many were actually experiencing severe housing cost burden. So for those of you who aren't familiar, that means that you're, as a renter, it could be a homeowner as well, but typically we focus on renters when we think about housing cost burden. You're paying more than 30% of your income is rent. When we say rent burden, that's what we mean. And severe rent burdens, you pay more than half your income is rent. I think the biggest difference between kind of the cities in Ohio, the city I occupy here, etc., is just that the percentage of people who are paying or who are severely rent burden is just much lower. And in California, you're going to find incredibly high percentages of people who make almost median income who are paying half their income as rent. So that's why the issues around housing instability are much more extreme there. That's why homelessness is much more extreme in California, and I could certainly talk more about that as well. So why do we care about people who are paying more than 30% of their income as rent? Well, there's a literature that talks about how people adjust to that constraint, and it can lead to decisions, I would say constrained decisions, that can have consequences long term. So they might be forced to double up. That's one path forward, is that you can't pay for your own rent, so you and another family move in together. You may not be able to spend money on other goods, spending money on other goods, some of which have important investment value, whether it's healthcare, education for your kids, etc. That can have issues. A common shift is to just live further and further away. So there are a lot of people in the LA region that were living in San Bernardino and then traveling 2 hours to work, at the beginning of the day, 2 hours home at the end of the day. It can also lead you to only be able to afford housing in neighborhoods that might have some serious disamenities of one kind or another. You might be, located next to toxic uses, or you might have high crime in the area. So this is why we worry about people who have affordability constraints. Again, a whole literature is out there that talks about a link between these affordability constraints and long-term outcomes that are lower than others. So in particular for kids, it's been been established by a number of papers, a link between lower educational attainment for children. In fact, this one paper finds something somewhat, at that 30% threshold, this like inverted U-shaped relationship between the fraction of income spent on housing, on the cognitive achievement and enrichment spending on children. They actually find that it's 30% inflection point is important. And so that, and for policy purposes, since HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, spent a lot of time around that 30% point, that is important. We have a paper out, which I'll reference in just a moment, that notes that remains very salient and important, but there's something else happening even at the severe rent burden side. But just again, to talk about the list of issues that exist, there's issues of increased incidence of mental illness, mental health issues. Myself and some part of our team at USC at the time, we did some work in San Diego where we established this just being a really, really high incidence issue for parents and their kids who were freaked out about their parents, like having to work, multiple jobs and not being able to provide enough. And so it kind of reinforced this negative cycle within the home, in health for the kids. And then this recently published paper that I was referencing, it really focused on documenting trade-offs for people who were rent burdened or severely rent burdened. Again, 30% of your income in rent or 50% of your income, right? And what we found is that 85% of residents who were rent burdened had cut back on some basic needs. So whether it was food or clothing or healthcare, etc. And I think the most important part of this study is that we were able to document that these were not just rent burden issues for this year, but the people have been cutting back for years, many of them for 5 years or more, which again links to these issues of long-term deteriorative outcomes down the road. We saw, as I noted here, like the different categories where the cutback was happening, and then among severely rent burdened households, what we found is that more people were likely to basically take on like sublet renters within the house, or just kind of, again, really overcrowd at higher levels. And importantly, in the sample, we asked people, if you had a $400 bill, could you pay it? And if so, what would the source of those funds be? 20% of the sample said, yes, I could pay it. I have enough on my credit limit on my credit card that I could wiggle a $400 bill. About 60% said, some mix of, I have family I could rely on to borrow some money from. I have, I could work overtime, like I can figure it out. 20% said, no, I would not be able to pay my rent anymore. So in thinking about the issues of extreme housing precarity, and especially again, living in Los Angeles, which is the epicenter of the homelessness human rights crisis that was there, you can see that if 20% of people who are severely rent burdened in any year just have one bill that's substantial, they are at risk of losing their housing. Yes, question. Yes, first up.
Can I ask a little more about the 20% not being able to do?
Yeah.
So, if you're gonna talk about this, but if it, you alluded that they would not be able to pay their rent. Was one of the questions, is there any color sort of about not being, like, choosing not to pay the bill instead of the rent?
Yeah, the way we asked the question kind of made it sound like that they would have to pay that bill for one reason or another. So then what will be the consequence of the fact of that? If you couldn't come up with the money or something. Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so we're talking of rent only, right, not including utilities, so the definition of rent refers to simply rent and not necessary utilities that are outside of rent.
Well, that's a good question. And typically it does vary. And most of the papers that I was citing were not including utilities, but that's why technically we talk about housing cost burdens. We are talking about the combination of these other things. But the data that a lot of times people rely on are just like, what are your stated contract rents? And they may or may not have had information on utilities.
And so that's, one of the things, just not knowing anything about how housing in California works, I wondered if, around here, it's not super typical that utilities are included in rent, but I wondered if that was systematic.
It is more typical that they're included in rent, but it's not,
It's not like
yeah, that's right. So I was thinking about I kept my house in California and I rented out, I was like, what am I doing there? I paid for some of the utilities because I had solar on my house, I was like, I'll pay the electric, because I'm not having to pay much anything, but how about you pay the water?
Yeah.
That kind of thing, because you don't want them just to kind of water all these desert plants all the time. All right, so that's kind of the, again, just kind of like the backdrop for why we're doing this inquiry. You know, the motivations for this particular paper, you know, are related because as we'll see when we look at the data, many of the people who were surveyed, you know, fit into this category. Over 80% of them were actually facing this rent for housing cost burden. So they're facing housing precarity. And so what we wanted to do in this paper is to see, does market dynamics, what's happening in the neighborhood, are rents going up very rapidly, are people moving in and out of the neighborhood a lot? Is there something else going on in the neighborhood that can actually affect how they, the tenant, interact with the landlords? And so in particular, as you'll see, this landlord behavior that we're interested in has to do with what kind of behavior, some of which would be illegal. But it'd be related to, you know, kind of the standard assumptions of landlord behavior. Right, so I don't know if you want to kind of reveal yourself, how many economists in the room? All right, we can just do, you know, one high five done, here we go. Got some housing policy folks, all right, high five, and then we have some students, we have some public affairs students, I assume, John Glenn, we're here at John Glenn, public affairs students. So your interdisciplinary, you know, training says a little bit of economics is part of it, right, so you at least understand those models, so we're gonna say, okay, well, landlords, they are maximizing profit, so what does that look like, in what context, and I think one of the things that is worth talking about, and there's non-economists and economists that debate, but probably more in the non-economist literature, talks about like, well, what can the landlords do? And the non-economist literature tends to say, well, they can do all sorts of things to kind of like extract out, you know, money from tenants and all those kinds of things. Whereas economists have leaned toward, gosh, there's, you know, hundreds and thousands of landlords, owners of properties. How could you possibly be able to, you know, extract rents, like we need economic rents in that context, because it would just be competed away. Right, so that's kind of the economic model. And I think there's something to be revisited in that model. Like Richard Arnott in a paper in 1995 was highlighting the fact that, remember, like in economics, when we have monopolistic competition or imperfect competition, you can still have pretty close to zero economic profit in the model, but there still is some sort of market power. So that's going to be an aside. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. But I think in thinking about what levers landlords have and how their behavior might be influenced by those levers in different market dynamic conditions, you know, we can think about landlords like, if the market for rents is going up, then they're going to try to figure out how can they make sure that their rents go up in lockstep with the market, or if they could, even above the market, right? And if markets, you know, are going up, that might mean that you're focused less on cost minimization. So as we'll talk about, cost minimization might mean not maintaining the unit that much, because then you worry if you don't maintain the unit as much, you're not going to be able to keep up with the markets, you're not going to compete on that level. But if you're in some markets, maybe it's not going up as fast, cost minimization might be your best strategy to extract more income stream from the property. So there's really nothing different, I should say. Again, perhaps didn't need to talk that long about it. If it wasn't just Don and I as economists, I'd say profit maximizing, let's continue. Let's not kind of separate out these different levers, but I think the market dynamic piece maybe has not been explored in kind of the same kind of data that we have here before. So I think it's interesting to do so. So what are some relevant literatures that we kind of draw upon to inform our hypothesis? And I should say, thank you for both asking questions. If anyone has any question anytime, please just raise your hand and just jump right in. I don't know how the colloquium kind of goes. They're cool with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, very good, very good. Yeah, it just depends on how many economists in the room. You don't have to tell them to do that. They just like a meeting. Let's go. So one of the things that's true in Los Angeles and in some cities around the country, I don't know about here, I don't even know about Cincinnati yet, is that there is rent control. This rent control is typically what's called second generation rent control, and one of the salient features of that rent control is that if your property is of a certain age, this is how it's set up in Los Angeles, then those buildings, when someone comes and occupies the unit, they pay a rent. From that point forward, that rent is locked into a maximum rent hike in any given year. So these are kind of like rental stabilization ordinances. It's also useful to know that typically rent control is not just about stabilizing the rent. It usually is tied together with kind of some sort of, a unit inspection regime and other kinds of protections that the renter would have that are not available to people who are not in rent control buildings in the same way. So when you think about rent control, the most obvious thing is that it will slow the rate of price appreciation, but it's usually tied to lots of other public policy interventions or resources. And so that's important to keep in mind. I highlight only 3 papers here. There's many papers on rent control and kind of its impact on markets and how it affects like desired maintenance and that sort of thing. And that's what the first paper finds is that if you see a reduction over time in the quality of units. And then in Sim's paper, there's little impact on the prices of non-rent stabilized units. So he didn't see a lot of spillover effects where there had been some older papers that showed that in the non-rent price sector, the prices of units went up faster than they would have otherwise because of the presence of the rent stabilized sectors. Sims did not find that, but this finding about the reduction in the quality of rent controlled units is one that has been hypothesized and has been found multiple times in the literature. The size of that it's not huge, but it still over time accumulates. And so you can, 30 years of rent control, that unit may not be nearly as high quality as a unit that had not experienced that rent control. So that's going to feed into this hypothesis around maintenance. So a rent controlled unit, one might imagine, is going to be maintained less because of not being able to extract as much income from that property. A couple of other papers talk a little bit about other mechanisms by which rent control and market dynamics, kind of feed together. This Diamond paper, which some of the faculty may have seen who did housing work, find that 15% of rent controlled units were actually sold to owner occupiers or redeveloped out of rent control status. So the one, again, salient feature in California's rent control is that if you know it's no longer an apartment, then you can sell it and charge whatever price you want. So if you feel trapped as an owner and you're not able to get the income that you might generate, and that is an appreciating market where you can make some money, then you might want to just sell it. And so they found that rent control had this effect where it actually took units out of the rental sector, moved it to the owner occupied sector, which could be, and I can't remember if they made a claim, like Sims was trying to look at the non-rent stabilized sector, but they may have done that. I'm just not remembering right now. Finally, related to some of our hypotheses, there's a recent paper that finds that rent control is most beneficial for the people who are resident in gentrifying neighborhoods. And you'll see in a moment why that's important and relevant for one of our hypotheses. So it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're in a place that's appreciating rapidly for various reasons, higher incomes, higher demand, etc., then rent control probably benefits you the most, right? Because your rent isn't going to go up as fast as the non-rent controlled unit. So that, I think, largely makes sense. Yes.
I'm wondering what's the effect of things becoming short-term rentals like Airbnb.
Well, there's a whole literature on that. And it's a notion of supply and demand in very simplest terms. And if certain units, and if you're in a supply constrained market that are being used for hospitality services and they're no longer available in the private rental market, we are showing, I have not contributed to that literature, so I shouldn't say we, but the literature has shown that does have an impact. If you're not in a supply constrained market, then you would imagine that the hospitality industry would either react to that by building more hotels, and or the private like multifamily industry would build more rental units. But if you're in a supply constrained place like Los Angeles, that people have found impacts of 2 to 6% in terms of the rate of price appreciation from my reading of the literature.
Think about the property management behavior. How do property taxes rate your rent control? Do you feel do the property values still appreciate and paying larger shares over time, but
That's a really good question. Turns out California has a whole nother kind of control. And that control is on property tax. So typically, like if you're in Ohio, then you can see that this could be particularly a problem. Is that if your property is appreciating in value, but you're not able to increase your rents, then you could really get yourself in a situation where you want to figure out a way around rent control one way or the other. In California, that piece is not driving it, because once you buy a property in California, we have something called Prop 13 passed in 1978 that says only when you sell a property does it get reassessed, and then from that baseline, it goes up 2% per year. So you have stabilization on property taxes, probably better than the rental stabilization in that sense, but that's a good point. All right, so that's just thinking about rent control is important, because it is part of this market. And I think in our sample, roughly 30% of the units were under some sort of rental stabilization. There's this a broader literature concept, which is called the rent gap, which in part motivated our research because this is an appreciating market in general. The 2010s in Los Angeles rents were going up much faster than people's incomes. So that's what we had in mind, is that, is the rent that's being charged even keeping up with the market rent? And what we were interested in is like, maybe there's some neighborhoods where the rent's going up and the landlords are keeping up with the market rents, and there's some that aren't. And if they aren't for whatever reason, well, rent control is certainly one institutional reason why that might be the case. But there's some other papers, these are non-economists that have talked about that maybe it's the case that gaps can persist in markets. Again, Don and I are all skeptical about such things. They're like, no, it's going to be competed away if they're not going to be in there. But maybe there are some institutional barriers, rent control being one. And Neil Smith writes about how landlords can behave differently as gaps in the kind of market rent versus the current rent exist. Christopher talks about the kind of political environment can influence behavior of landlords. And so even if you don't have rent control and rents are going up rapidly in the market, maybe you feel pressure not to raise the rent on these tenants because there could be a tenants union or something like that might come at you politically. And if you're a big landlord, you don't want that. And so, the simplest thing that, in a rent gap situation is you would just want to raise the rent. And that's how you would respond to a rent gap. You as a landlord realize, oh, wait, I'm behind. Oh, next year, I'm just going to raise the rent 15% when my lease comes due. Whatever the case might be. But their writing is just talking about maybe there's different mechanisms, structures, transaction costs, maybe you have rapidly changing market dynamics, as I say in the first point, where you're just not keeping up with it in one way or another. And so what we kind of hypothesize within this construct is that market dynamics can influence landlord behaviors in the following way. If you're in a declining market, we would hypothesize that you would focus on cost minimization or neglect, as some of the literature talks about, and retention strategies. You want to figure out how can you keep your tenant in there because you don't want a vacancy, right? And you want to figure out how you can maintain this unit in a time when there isn't great return on investments. Okay, so that would be hypothesized there. In an improving market, we hypothesize that you would focus as a landlord on maximization of rent strategies. And perhaps the challenge in those strategies is that you might face rent control. And in the case of second generation rent control, another salient feature is that you get to raise the rent to the market if that tenant moves and leaves. Okay. And then there's other kinds, so this would be part of Sean Hank's dissertation. He found that this can lead to harassment of existing tenants if you're in that situation, because you want the tenant to move on. And the rent control is allowing them to stay. They're like, okay, let's get someone new in here so I can actually charge the market rent. And then the one piece I guess I forgot to put on the slide is this, and maybe it's on a later slide. For us who are faculty who are been around for a little while, we forget we put on our slides. So I apologize if it's going to come later. But I wanted to have a bullet point on the gentrification side of things. So by gentrification, I know that that's a whole nother literature set of papers that people have read and issues that people have cared deeply about. And usually the most salient factors have to do with, do increasing rents cause pressure on people who have stable or declining incomes such that they might have to leave where they were? So that's the term displacement associated with gentrification. The other piece is, well, who's then occupying those units? And a lot of times there's a change in kind of the, like, for instance, the education level is a common metric that people focus on. And so if you see people with college degrees moving into neighborhoods where there weren't a lot of college degrees, that would be a piece of evidence for gentrification happening. And so the argument here as well, in terms of an improving market, is that if you have a non-college educated tenant, and you really want a college educated tenant because you own a building or sets of buildings, and you're trying to capture the benefits of this gentrifying pressure, then you actually want college educated tenants that you can show around to these new prospective college educated tenants. So that will also put pressure for you to say to an existing tenant, I kind of want you to move on in one way or another. And so that can also lead to strategies which we will define as harassment, and I'll walk through the actual definition of how we surveyed and tried to identify harassment. Okay, before I jump into the data, any questions on just the concepts running around here in the paper? All right, I'll just jump on in. So the household survey, in the paper that was circulated, we don't talk quite as much about the details since we had published the other paper, which we spent a lot more time on the details. But that's central component. We surveyed 2 neighborhoods, as I'll show on subsequent slides, in South and Central Los Angeles. These are neighborhoods that also happen to be in a federal promise zone program that were identified as neighborhoods that, while had high poverty, they also had potential because of the strong community social structure that was existed. So lots of good social service organizations, nonprofit organizations, and so forth. So they were poised to improve. That was part of the Obama administration's promise zone program. So we can talk in much more detail about what those neighborhoods are, why we chose them, et cetera, later. We ended up scraping data from this service. There's many of them out there these days called Rentometer to get building and unit market specific rents. Zillow has their zip code level rents and so forth, but we wanted to be more precise about the rents. And so this gave us an opportunity to do that. I think, fortunately you can do it in a relatively short amount of time. So you pay like, a 1 monthly fee and then you go crazy and you get everything you can do. We only had 800 people in the sample, so we didn't need a lot of data. And then we just used data on gentrification pressures from the Urban Displacement Project. And people may or may not be familiar with this project. They basically created a coding system of what neighborhoods are kind of poised for gentrification, already had gentrified, or there was no pressure at all. And we can talk about what those categories are. It's not perfect by any means. Anytime you have an index, you can kind of talk about, well, are you capturing really what's going on? And in large part, you might be capturing a piece of it, but not all of it. But it actually performed in our model better than I expected, to be honest. So how did we come up with the survey? These are the details that we can just give you a sense of what we were trying to do. Well, as I had mentioned, I'm an economist, not trained in doing surveys in communities. So we put together a team and we started off by actually doing 7 different focus groups in different communities to make sure the kinds of questions that we were asking about housing precarity were actually useful. And then we generated a survey because we only had enough money to do this once. And this is a big undertaking, so you don't want to screw up and ask the wrong question at the wrong time. So you really want to have your questions in order. And we asked about all sorts of questions that are relevant to this paper. We asked about, kind of like how people were moving, where did they live, and, basically their housing histories. We asked about their support networks. We asked about we use kind of the formalized stress indices that you get from the medical profession in terms of people experiencing mental health issues or stress and those kinds of things. We asked them about housing conditions, maintenance issues, all sorts of things. This was funded in 2018, 2019. We were fortunate to have completed the survey before COVID hit, because that would have, anyone doing primary data collection that span, unfortunately, into 2020 would have been in trouble. you know, we can talk about to the extent that the 2019 period represented something, you know, unique or not unique, within that region. I think more importantly, this paper gets situated within, if you are a hot market, this is the kind of thing one might imagine, especially on the policy side. What do you need to worry about? And I was telling others, I was preparing for a presentation that ended up getting snowed out. By the way, that's never happened to me in my life. Until Friday, there was a Hamilton County snow emergency. So my presentation, you know, got axed among the others as well. But I saw Zillow had just put out a projection of the hottest housing markets in the country. And the 3 C's are in the top 10. Can you believe it? That's why I said I'm bringing my high prices here. Cincinnati's number 2, Columbus number 4, and Cleveland number 9, I think is what it was. So if you're in a market that's starting to heat up, this paper would kind of fit into that context more than a declining market. We wanted to cover more languages, to be honest, because one of these promise zones has a lot of immigrants from Asia. We just didn't have the resources to do so, so we were only able to introduce English and Spanish. All right, so this is the geography. This is very familiar to me. I've been in Los Angeles. It may not be familiar to any of you at all. You probably heard of South LA and so forth. USC is right here. So you can at least situate it. This is Interstate 10. This is 110 for people who have been there, or if you visited USC, you know where that is. And then north of that is what's called, I call Central Los Angeles. And as I said, these were federally designated promise zones. So again, orienting yourself, these are places that were more likely to have gentrification pressures in general, because they were like poised to something good to happen. And those were designated in 2014 and 2016. So we ended up doing a geographically stratified randomized sample. So, you know, you can have a really strong random sample of residents, and we did a lot of knocking. We approached 11,262 addresses for a 50-minute interview. We had enough resources to give a $20 gift card. When we spoke to people, 32% were eligible respondents, that they actually were part of the household decision making. That was our eligibility criterion. So you get a kiddo answer that we could not interview them for purposes here. We ended up having a 20% response rate of eligible respondents. So these are people that said, yes, we will fill out the surveys. We ended up with roughly 800 surveys, roughly equal between South Los Angeles and Central Los Angeles. So it's, and again, for those of you who know LA at all, so this was kind of Central Los Angeles promise zone goes from MacArthur Park north to East Hollywood. So that's kind of that range of places. But again, maybe not in this room. People have gone into those places. Yeah.
So response rate of 20%, not great. It's been lower in some other things. Do you expect that the response rate would be more selective in these types of areas than they would be if you did something general public nationally? That is, people would be more skeptical of doing a survey in these Los Angeles areas?
I don't think so. I mean, this is certainly on the higher end of getting a response rate from door to door, not surveys, when you're asking for people to sit with you for 50 minutes. So I think, you know, you could imagine if we were able to pay them $100, for instance, we would have gotten a higher response rate. But I don't have an answer for you in terms of like if you did this, what kind of response rate might you expect? We were worried about not having a lot of immigrants actually respond to us because this is during the Trump administration, and you know, while LA is out of the 100-mile zone of enforcement and so forth, there's still many immigrant families that just we're not talking to anybody that's but we still ended up with about 35% of our families in our sample that were immigrant families. But again, I said in the LA promise zone, the Central Los Angeles area, we did lose because we didn't have enough languages. Yes.
Yeah, I was actually thinking 20% was amazingly high. And
Yeah.
but
That's because we had really nice students doing most of the surveying, and I think people kind of go,
oh, it's nice young person.
yes.
Well, so I was gonna ask you, how big was your field staff? How many people did you have? It's 11,000, approaching 11,000 addresses.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. So I was at the time running our Price Center for Social Innovation. We had like a suites, and we would, every day we'd have like 6 to 8 that we were sending out. The PIs, the team, as I said, the authors on the paper, we were training the students on how to do surveys, or 2 at a time for every, place. So one person could take notes, one person could ask questions. We had about 20. It would be like kind of at the apex, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little more, but it was a big undertaking. I would not do it with, like, we had, I think, roughly $200,000 to do it. That wasn't really enough. It was tight. It was hard. It's one of those kind of like labor of love kind of things. I don't think, we definitely wouldn't do this again for that amount of money, but the data we're getting are quite good, so we're excited. All right, so talk a little bit about rent-a-meter, just basically to assuage any concerns that the data we were scraping or not really matched that well with the data that we were hearing from our tenants who responded to the survey. What we were doing, looking at the data in the block group, then we can look at housing unit type, so studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom. We were able to even do it at the unit level and so forth in the models that we estimated, though we found that we didn't get any additional precision relative to the census block group. So we did aggregate the census block group. The rental ranges in rent-o-meter run from 1,000 to 4,500. And that shows some of the diversity of it, especially in the central LA promise zone. So some of those areas were close enough to Hollywood that they were quite expensive. Whereas in South LA, they were less likely to be. South LA was also more likely to have single family homes that were being rented out as opposed to multifamily, which is mostly in the central. And by the way, I don't know what I'm thinking.
It's an hour, so,
It's an hour.
yeah, so you've got about 20.
All right, so I will.
This clock's a little fast.
Okay, okay.
It's a time.
Okay. And we do some robustness checks. I won't have time to talk about it here, but we looked at Zillow Rent Index. We looked at HUD's small area farm market rents in Los Angeles, the ACS, and so on and so forth. We actually were this is one reason we went with the rent-o-meters. The range was actually the same, whereas if you go use census data, it's a lot lower. And even though I've read this literature about why, it just doesn't make a lot of sense why it's so much lower. So pretty good. We're happy with these data. And then the urban displacement project, pretty straightforward. They put neighborhoods into these 5 categories. So kind of like the low income neighborhood, the low income neighborhood that's experienced displacement, and then there's gentrification. Kind of like this neighborhood that's at risk, and these have already begun or have already gentrified fully, and we combine these to highlight neighborhoods that were in those categories. And you can see that while gentrification is happening, it's not everywhere in these neighborhoods. Some of these are low income neighborhoods that remain low income neighborhoods. They're not experiencing any risk. And you'll see that there's a few more in the advanced up in the central Los Angeles promise zone than there are in the south. And that's really all I want you to see from the picture. Yes, there's variation. And that variation is such that even you have geographic variation between the 2 areas. All right, so this is something that we can maybe return to later. You may have it in the back of your mind. I think the challenges to interpretation whenever you're doing a survey sample of people in a particular place, you don't have longitudinal data on them, is that you need to think about, well, who didn't get surveyed? So the first step is 20% good? Did you make sure the people that answered your survey, are they different than the rest of the population? In the other paper, we kind of go through why we think we did a pretty good job of not having that issue. But what we can't speak to directly is if you are missing the people that moved, then that group might be very different in composition to those that currently live there. We only have evidence to compare the people who recently moved in with the people who didn't recently move in. And there we don't see, in terms of the summary data, anything that's statistically different about them in terms of their incomes, their race, ethnicity, immigrant status, etc. So we know that to be the case. If you then assume that the people that moved out weren't any different than the people that are moving in, then you can say, okay, this is cool. The people that you interviewed are probably the right ones. What we argue, or at least my own thinking, is that if we're trying to test for harassment within the data, and so I think it's likely the case that it could bias the results. that we find on harassment downward, because if you were harassed, you might have already left. So you might see that, and so just keep that in the back of your mind. And it might be the case that people with lower income and gentrifying areas are more likely to leave than people who are moving in, so just, we have to think about this and talk about it. All right, so just some summary data that we found interesting to highlight, which I didn't have a good sense of other papers, what we might find, but one fact is that 24% of renters lived in what you would call hazardous living conditions or not having units up to code. So this is part of our survey, so we went through using some of the data, basically the same questions the American Housing Survey used to figure out, you know, what kind of conditions. So like a quarter of the sample in the rental units have something that's substantially wrong with their unit. So this is kind of just baseline, and we actually found that this did not correlate with any of our other hypotheses. It was just like this was happening everywhere. And then 8.8% who asked for a fix were routinely rejected, never had a yes. It was just, nope, it was just a ghost, you know, like this, you don't have water running. Nothing. So again, these are just big numbers, which should call out to policymakers that things like code enforcement, safety enforcement, these kinds of things, we need to be responsive to, because a large segment of the population. What we found, and we weren't sure how it was going to work out, is that residents in gentrifying tracts were actually more likely to have their maintenance needs met. At first, we thought if you were trying to get the person out, you would ignore their calls. But the counter hypothesis is, if you want to rent it out at a really high price, you better keep the unit maintained and ready for that moment if you want. So again, this is the evidence from the data, me interpreting it. You know, it's kind of my spin on it, but we found that initially to be interesting, because we had actually thought the converse, which was you would try to like harass your tenants by not meeting their needs, so they left. That we did not find that in gentrifying tracts. So here's some of the summary data on neglect. Again, we're focusing just on kind of these three concepts. One is, are there really large rent gaps between your unit and your neighborhood? Do you live in a place that rent control exists, or are you living in a neighborhood that has experienced some measure of gentrification? And so you can say these are some neglect variables. I'm trying to remember on this slide if we just kind of grouped everything together. So we have any maintenance issue. We have, this is kind of the converse of that, is the landlord always fixed everything, and this is like a list of hazardous conditions, which I have not spent time kind of going through the full list of key items that could be there. And you see that there are, you know, differences across places that have rent gaps and those that don't have rent gaps, rent control versus non-rent control sometimes. But the only difference that in the summary data on neglect that was statistically significant was this one I referenced already about gentrification. So this was actually one of those tables that you kind of put up, you're excited about, look at the data, and you're like, oh, well, neglect really, like none of our hypotheses met with any kind of interaction with neglect or lack of maintenance. So that's the evidence there. When we talk about harassment, I want to be a little more clear, because this is where most of the action in the paper was, what we mean by harassment. So the first one is that you actually had an illegal rent increase. So you might think, well, how can you do that in a rent controlled unit? Well, you can still have people say, this is your rent, and that forces you as a tenant to then go to the rental stabilization board and say, hey, they just raised my rent by 10%. They said I have to leave if I don't, and it becomes, you know, a whole legal thing. So that is one measure of harassment. The 13% of actually a verbal threat or a physical threat or an assault. So that's a 1 in 8 actually had a landlord threaten or physically touch a tenant to tell them, you know, I guess harass them. We're gonna use that term harassment. There are, in these last categories, this is kind of like a really weird thing. You might think, why would you refuse a rent check? And that is this whole thing with, especially with rent control, it's just like, nope, no, you gotta leave, I'm not taking your money. You know, and so there's those kinds of things that happen. at a higher incidence than I expected. Illegal eviction again has to do with tenants that are in a rent controlled unit, where they're evicted anyway, even though they're not allowed to be evicted. So these are just things that have been happening to people in these units. And so that's where we see in the rent controlled units, much higher rates, just in terms of the summary data of that. And that's what you can see here. Just to kind of look at where those kind of stars are. So in terms of any harassment, 7% more likely in a rent controlled unit. If you have illegal rent increases, the biggest thing there had to do with if there were really big rent gaps in the neighborhood, and in terms of refusing to accept the rent check, that was for, showed up in rent control. And this is just summary data. So as I kind of move toward conclusion, let's do a little bit of regression controlled summary data here. So we'll look at the associations between our hypotheses and the incidence of harassment. First of all, in terms of control variables, we saw that throughout the region, households that were headed by a Black or Latino person were more likely to report harassment. Families reported less harassment than individuals, and those with government subsidies reported more harassment, just in terms of the underlying data, which fits with a lot of other literature. And that's going to be some of the control variables. Let me just jump ahead to our hypotheses. So we expected with rent gaps that you would, here's what we found is that with higher rent gaps, we actually found less likely to be harassed. Again, at first that surprised us, but I'll have my explanation I'll offer at the end for why we think this was probably going on. It was probably simpler than we initially thought. And then in accordance with hypothesis, the residents of rent controlled units reported more harassment and illegal evictions, and residents of tracts that were in gentrifying areas also expressed more harassment and threats. Okay, and here's the numbers that go with that in terms of the sizes. In terms of, rent control, I think it's 10 percentage points is reported, just having at least one issue with harassment. That's a big number. And I think it's something to kind of understand the underlying incidents. And also in terms of the gentrification, we saw that having 3 or more, you have a 3 percentage points higher likelihood of experiencing 3 or more. At least one is 8.6%, and then the threat one 7.6%. If you're living in a gentrifying area, I think was, I think important to keep in mind. So these are big numbers in my view, relative to baseline. When you think about the baseline being 24%, so this is 7.6% higher, this is big. This is big. In terms of neglect, nothing really showed up. In the underlying level, is like 1 in 4 had some measure of not upkeep of the unit. These are in 4 neighborhoods, but they were not linked to our hypotheses. And we didn't see something different in rent control versus in gentrifying versus those that just had higher rent gaps in general. We did a lot of other sensitivity analysis where we looked at not just the individuals reporting their own kinds of, like my unit's not being taken care of and so forth, but instead looking at Los Angeles building and safety data to see if it looked the same as the incidence of them reporting harassments, and at that level it's more aggregated, but the results, were just noisier, but they were not inconsistent with what we found with survey data. In particular, the higher reported violations of rent control units were consistent there. There were fewer reports in gentrifying areas. Again, this is like one of those things where in those gentrifying areas, it was not an issue of not enough maintenance there. So getting to kind of our final interpretation of the study. Number one, we did find that market dynamics mattered. And mattered in important ways. These are ways that I think really do link to policy, because if you have a neighborhood which is gentrifying or gentrified in terms of, again, the definitions that you might use, but I think having a shift in the education levels of the neighborhood, a shift in the income levels of the neighborhood, what we're finding is that if you are, worried about and it's not being treated properly, you need to go to those neighborhoods just to make sure that the tenants who are there are being treated in accordance with the law. We find it didn't have anything to do with rent gap, and here's our explanation for that. We said, well, maybe having a large rent gap, if you don't have these other market dynamics, just says that the landlord's best strategy is to raise the rent as fast as possible. And if you're gonna raise the rent as fast as possible, they're not gonna pay it if you're harassing them. And so you also don't want turnover. So maybe it's the case that rent gap just is signaling what's gonna happen, as we say here in the final bullet point. It's gonna say, here's what's happening now. It doesn't really tell us what's gonna happen in the future as much. Whereas rent control, that's locking in a tenant long term. And so maybe your strategy as a landlord, if you don't want to obey the law, is to try to figure out a way to get a new tenant in there so that you can raise the rent. If you're in a gentrifying area, the issue there is that you want tenants with different characteristics than were there before. Like they could still raise the rent. But you might be able, if you're a landlord that owns multiple buildings, you might actually find a profit maximizing strategy to change the characteristics of those of your tenants so that you can more rapidly take advantage of such profit. So that's what we found in the paper. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Great, we have about 10 minutes to get some discussion going. Yeah. Jade.
Thanks so much. Really interesting stuff. I was curious, I had a couple questions.
Yeah.
First, do you have any sense of the extent to which these units were managed by landlords themselves or property managers? Because my kind of prior would be that property management companies are they know the laws better, they know the restrictions, and therefore they'd be less likely to harass a tenant or assault a tenant. I'm just, not sure, but I think that'd probably be something interesting to think about. But the second one, and then I'll just go offline, is I think in terms of profit maximizing, there's kind of this trade-off, which you've mentioned, but I'm curious, like, what is the relative size of the rent gap to the opportunity cost of, or the actual cost, I guess, of the vacancy, right? Like,
Right.
If they raise the rent, they're gonna get $300 per month, but if they go vacant, they're gonna lose $2,000 a month or whatever, based on your. So.
Yeah, so I'll comment on the first point is that it turned out that the tenants typically didn't really have a clue. Whether they were talking to the landlord, talking to a property manager, who's working with the landlord, and that was just kind of puts us in that situation where we just simply can't answer that question. You're right that you could imagine, and there is kind of like there's mixed both, I would call them feelings and evidence. There's feelings that like the more like from some advocacy circles that the more like professionalized these things get, actually, you might see quicker evictions or quicker kind of like responses to different market dynamics because you can then lower your turnover costs because you can get someone new in there much more quickly than if it's just a mom and pop who happens to have 4 properties, and so they are renting them out and kind of doing it individually. So I feel like I have not seen anything conclusive either in terms of like the actual evidence about how quickly a property management company might operate vis-a-vis a small mom and pop landlord. I've just seen lots of data that suggests, that the mom and pops are perhaps, like you said, less likely to know the laws, so they might be behaving in an illegal manner. Whereas the property manager might be like trying to take advantage of market dynamics, might be swayed in ways we unfortunately. That's a lot to say we like our people responding to the survey just didn't know. They just said no. So your second point, it has to do with the issue of vacancy. Well, situating this study, again, if you're in a hot market, that means that this evidence fits very well what's happening in hot markets where vacancy really wasn't going to be the chief concern. Right, I know I'm in Ohio now. Not every market in Ohio is probably as hot as that one in Los Angeles, but yeah, so it's kind of situating. This study is finding like it's definitely not in a flat or declining market. It's in a market where the rental pressure is much higher than even the people's underlying. So, it's a good point, so yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I've learned a lot actually about this process, and it reminds me of work that folks in sociology have been doing about how real estate agents actually contribute to people paying higher prices through face-to-face interactions and things like that. My question was about one of the points that you discussed with respect to Black and Latino residents reporting more harassment. And I wondered, I don't remember if this was on your slide, but what percentage of, the sample of 800 people identified as Black and Latino was one of the questions that I had.
It's in the paper, but I don't have it on the top of my head, so if we can circulate that, if it hasn't been circulated, we'll.
I think it was like 30% Latino or like 266 out of your.
Well, that was how many people we did the.
Oh,
in
in Spanish, sorry. Okay,
But
okay.
it was a much larger percentage that were Latino. I think it was half or slightly more than half, and then people who identified as Black were like somewhere in the 8% range.
And then the other question that I had was, I can't remember what you said in one of the slides, who sort of responded to the actual survey request, and would you all use like just a standard interview protocol that you presented to everybody who responded?
Yes, we did, yeah. So it was all kind of on an iPad where like, so that if someone answered this one, then it jumped over to the next one. So they just had to be someone that had some say in the financial decision making of the household. So in our sample, we did find the actual respondent, I think it was over 70% were women. And it wasn't necessarily because we were going during the work day and they may have had childcare responsibilities and so forth. We also we surveyed on weekends, we surveyed at night. We wanted to make sure we had as many possibilities covered, but in the end, we ended up with over 70% women who were the respondents, but they were part of the financial decision making. Yeah.
Just a quick question, on the second to, the first question, so on the property, on the property versus the property manager, is that something that would have been, that would be there on the Zillow or the rental meter, scraping? From the unit level?
Now, that's a good point. We might be able we probably can from the renometer, look and see who the name is. And then, like, again, if both of them are some sort of corporate name, then you still may not quite get it right. I mean, for me, so I rented out my house, I hired a property manager, so otherwise I would have been the mom and pop. Like thinking about like my dealings, like maintenance issues get a lot quicker with the property manager than if it was me, because then it'd be like me, I was like, oh gosh, I have to call a plumber to do this, whatever. And then for them, I signed a contract with them, if it's less than $500, they just do it. And then they let me know after the fact, like, oh, this costs $500, $400. Now that has incentive for me, I was like, are you sure you needed to do that? Like as a mom and pop, I'd be like, no, I could I could call you from Ohio and say, you just need to unscrew this, it'll be fine. Because I know my house, like the property manager is like, I can't have them unscrewing that. I'm like, that for the past 15 years I lived in that house, that's how I fix that problem. You just every 2 years you have to. They're like, no. But you're right, we might be able to look at the listings. I think we would still have some challenges, but at least, in some listings we would have names versus.
And one more, usually some of these statistics of variable. I'm wondering if you had them like broken out by the amount of time that the respondent had stayed in that particular place. So for example, I imagine that in the gentrifying neighborhood, especially at where it's getting currently, there's a respondent that's recently moved in, and we have reason to believe that particular result of the identification, right? And maybe some of those outcome variables like the maintenance time, like neglect, etc., would be different for.
Yeah.
So
The only thing that we did in results not shown is we did look at, just the people who had moved in 2 years or less and then compared them overall. Now, this is where, like, in my career, I usually was much more comfortable with data sets that had hundreds of thousands of observations, so I could detect such differences. So it's possible that in our sample, just because we're talking about hundreds, maybe we weren't able to detect such differences, but we did not find them. So like the point estimate, it's really close to the same. So that gave us some comfort, but again, that's the right question to ask, like what's driving what?
So now even
No, we didn't see any statistically significant differences.
We're at time.
Okay.
Okay, but there's some questions.
Yeah, I can hang out.
But yeah, the doctoral students, we usually love to have it. The doctoral students can hang around and meet with Gary afterwards. I don't know if you have time to do that. Yay, nay, looking at you guys. Yes, no, you have a class?
A couple.
A couple, okay, good, all right. Great, well, join me again and thank you, Gary.